Somewhere in a drawer in a museum in France, there is a small lump of bronze that has quietly broken more academic arguments than almost any other object from the ancient world. It is smaller than a tennis ball. It has 12 flat faces, a round hole cut into the center of each one, and a tiny knob sitting on every corner where the faces meet. Nobody living has ever seen it used. Nobody living has ever read a single sentence explaining what it was for. And the strange part isn't that we don't know what it is. The strange part is that the Romans, the same people who wrote down how to build roads, how to lay saw pipe, how to season a chicken, and how to file a tax complaint against your neighbor, never once mentioned this thing. Not in a letter. Not in a will. Not in a shopping list. Whatever this object was, somebody decided it wasn't going to be written down. And that silence is exactly why, 2,000 years later, we are still arguing about it. Before we go further, I want to be straight with you, because the title of this video promises an ending, and I owe you the truth about that ending before we get there. The Roman Dodecahedron has not been solved in the way a cold case gets solved, with a name, a motive, and a confession. What has happened is something almost more interesting. Over the last few years, researchers using better dating methods, wider comparison across finds, and more careful experimental archaeology have narrowed the field of realistic explanations down hard, and in doing so they've quietly killed off almost every popular theory you've heard on the internet. What's left standing is smaller, stranger, and in some ways more unsettling than the wild guesses, because it points less toward mystery, and more toward something very human, a tool built for a purpose so ordinary that nobody thought it was worth writing about, wrapped in enough ritual, or guild secrecy that no one bothered to explain it to outsiders either. Stay with me, because getting to that answer means walking through every dead end first, and some of those dead ends are more revealing than the destination. Let's start with the basic shape, because the geometry itself is the first clue nobody talks about properly. A dodecahedron is one of the 5 Platonic solids, the perfectly symmetrical three-dimensional shapes that Greek mathematicians obsessed over centuries before Rome existed. 12 faces, each one a regular pentagon, 20 vertices where 3 faces meet, 30 edges. This is not folk geometry. This is not something a bored soldier whittles by accident with a knife on a cold night at a garrison wall. To cast an object like this in bronze, you need a wax or clay master model built to genuine geometric rules, a mold that can survive molten metal poured at close to 1,000 degrees Celsius, and then a finishing process to clean up the casting seams and drill the holes afterward. This was a deliberate, planned, multi-step manufacturing project, not a doodle. Whoever was making these understood solid geometry well enough to translate it into a physical casting, which already tells us the maker, or the person who commissioned the maker, wasn't working from ignorance. They were working from a plan. Here's where the popular retellings usually go wrong, and it's worth clearing this up early. You'll see videos and articles claiming that laser scans have revealed jaw-dropping, otherworldly precision in these objects, tolerances that supposedly rival modern machining, hidden mathematical ratios encoded across every specimen, and a suspicious pattern where the oldest examples are somehow the most perfect, as if the skill degraded over time instead of improving. It's a great story. It is also not something that has been demonstrated in the actual archaeological literature. Real measurement studies of dodecahedra, the kind published by museums and universities rather than repeated in comment sections, show what you'd expect from skilled handcraftsmanship in bronze. Some faces close to regular, some visibly uneven, hole diameters that vary from piece to piece without a single universal ratio running through all of them, and wall thicknesses that differ because these were cast by hand, in sand or clay molds, by real metal workers doing real work, not robots. The objects are impressive. They are not supernatural. And frankly, the honest version is more interesting than the exaggerated one, because it means we are looking at genuine, hard-won ancient craftsmanship rather than a mystery that requires lost civilizations, or secret advanced technology to explain. So what do we actually know? Around 130 of these objects have been recovered so far, and new ones still turn up occasionally during excavations, which is part of why the story keeps evolving. The overwhelming majority were found in the northwestern provinces of the Roman world, the regions that today cover parts of France, Germany, Switzerland, Belgium, Luxembourg, Austria, and Hungary. That's the old frontier zone, the border country where Roman civilian and military life pressed up against Celtic and Germanic populations for centuries. Almost none have turned up in Italy, the historical heartland of the empire, and none have shown up in Roman Britain in significant numbers either, despite Britain being just as thoroughly excavated. That geographic clustering is real, it's consistent, and it's one of the strongest clues we have, because it strongly suggests this wasn't a universal Roman product distributed across the whole empire. It looks like a regional phenomenon tied to specific communities, possibly specific trade networks, or even specific ethnic or cultural groups living inside Roman territory, most likely connected to Gallo-Roman culture. The blended Roman and Celtic society that developed in what's now France and its neighboring regions. Now let's actually go through the theories, because the process of elimination here is where the real story lives. The candle holder theory is probably the most repeated explanation online, and it's also one of the weakest under scrutiny. If you were routinely burning a candle, or an oil-soaked wick inside one of these hollow bronze shells, you'd expect soot staining or heat discoloration on the interior surfaces, especially given how enclosed the chamber is. Researchers who've examined dodecahedra closely generally report no consistent burn residue that would support regular use as a lamp or candle holder. It's not impossible that one or two were repurposed that way at some point in their life, but as an explanation for the entire class of object across multiple provinces and generations, it doesn't hold up. The dice or gaming piece theory runs into a similar wall. Ancient dice existed, and we have plenty of them, and they look nothing like this. A 12-sided object with holes of different diameters cut through every face is a bizarre design for random number generation. It doesn't roll predictably, it doesn't land flat, and there's no obvious way to read a result of it. If Romans wanted a 12-sided randomizer, simpler and cheaper shapes were well within their capability, and we'd expect to find far more of them if gaming were the purpose, spread evenly across the empire rather than clustered on one frontier. The military rangefinder theory has more surface appeal, and you'll see it argued seriously in some hobbyist circles. The idea is that a soldier could hold the object at arm's length, sight through the graduated holes, and estimate distance to a target, or the strength of an enemy formation based on which hole an object of known size fit inside. It's a clever idea, and it's not physically impossible to use an object this way. But it runs into the same geographic problem as everything else. Roman legions operated across the entire empire, from Britain to North Africa to the Middle East. If this was standard-issue military equipment, or even unofficial soldier-made kit, we would expect it scattered wherever Roman soldiers were stationed in numbers, not concentrated almost exclusively in one cultural zone. The knitting or glove-making tool theory deserves more respect than the others, because unlike the rest, someone actually tested it properly. A textile historian built a wax replica, and used the graduated holes and corner knobs to work multiple strands of yarn simultaneously into a tube shape, essentially producing a knitted glove finger. The experiment worked, and it produced a plausible-looking result. That's genuinely a point in favor of a textile-related function, or at least it proves this shape can function in that role. But there's a real problem with treating this as the final answer. The technique that was successfully reproduced uses a method that historians can't actually confirm existed in Roman Gaul at the right time, and bronze is a strange, heavy, expensive material to choose if wood or bone would do the same job just as well for a purely domestic craft tool. Expensive cast bronze objects usually signal status, ritual importance, or specialized function, not a humble household knitting aid that any local woodworker could carve for free. That leads to the theory that a growing number of archaeologists now take most seriously, even though it's less flashy than a secret machine or ancient technology. These were surveying or measuring instruments, possibly used to calibrate or check pipe diameters, coin standards, or construction tolerances. Alternatively, they served a role that was primarily religious, ceremonial, or tied to a guild or fraternal organization rather than practical craftsmanship at all. Some researchers point to the fact that dodecahedra are sometimes found alongside coin hoards, which might hint at a connection to currency or value, possibly functioning as a kind of portable gauge for checking coin diameters against known standards, which would matter a great deal in a world without standardized manufacturing. Others lean toward the idea that the object had symbolic or religious weight tied to the number 12 itself, echoing the 12 months, the 12 zodiac signs, or numerological ideas that were genuinely important across Gallo-Roman religious life, meaning the object might never have had a single practical job at all, and instead functioned the way a ceremonial staff or a Masonic emblem does today, a marker of belonging, status, or spiritual meaning, made in a form deliberately withheld from ordinary explanation because outsiders weren't meant to fully understand it. This is, honestly, where the silence in the historical record starts to make more sense than any single practical use ever could. If the dodecahedron was simply a tool, we would expect at least a passing mention somewhere across the enormous volume of surviving Roman writing, the way we have offhand references to sundials, surveying rods, and measuring cups. Practical Roman tools got written about because practical people wrote practical things down. But objects tied to local religious practice, initiation rites, or craft guild identity were often deliberately kept out of the written record, especially among provincial populations whose traditions predated and coexisted uneasily with official Roman culture. Guild knowledge in the ancient world was frequently oral, passed from master to apprentice, and specifically not committed to writing, because writing it down meant losing control of who had access to it. That pattern isn't unique to Rome. It shows up in craft traditions and religious brotherhoods across history, right up through medieval guilds centuries later. If the dodecahedron carried meaning inside a closed cultural or religious circle in Gaul and the neighboring provinces, its absence from Roman literature isn't a mystery at all. It's exactly what you'd expect. So where does that leave us? Not with a single, tidy, confirmed answer, and I think it's important to say that plainly rather than promise you a solved case that doesn't exist yet. What the evidence does support is a much narrower, much more grounded picture than the internet usually offers. This was very likely an object tied to a specific cultural community within the Roman provinces of Gaul and its neighboring regions, cast in bronze using real geometric planning and genuine skilled craftsmanship, whose function blended practical use, quite possibly connected to measurement, textile work, or checking standards, with symbolic or ritual meaning significant enough that outsiders were never given, or never sought, an explanation worth writing down. The precision is real but human, the product of skilled hands working within the real limits of ancient bronze casting, not evidence of forgotten super technology. And the silence surrounding it is real too, but it's a silence with a plausible, grounded explanation. Some knowledge simply wasn't meant to travel outside the circle that held it, and when that circle eventually disappeared, sometime before the fall of Roman rule in the region, the meaning went with it. What makes this genuinely worse than expected isn't a conspiracy, or a lost civilization. It's something quieter and, if you think about it, a little more haunting. It's the realization that an enormous amount of what ordinary people knew and valued in the ancient world simply vanished, not because it was hidden by some grand design, but because most human knowledge throughout history was never written down in the first place. We assume the past left us a complete record because the surviving fragments feel so vivid, the letters, the graffiti, the tax receipts. But those fragments are a tiny, biased sliver of everything that was actually known, believed, and practiced by real people who had no reason to think their everyday world needed explaining to anyone, let alone to us, 2,000 years later. The dodecahedron isn't a message from a hidden intelligence. It's a leftover from ordinary lives, made by ordinary craftsmen, for a purpose that mattered enough to make, but not enough to record, and that gap between making and recording is where an enormous amount of the past has simply fallen through the cracks. So here's what I'd leave you with. The next time you hold up an everyday object in your own life, Think about how much of its meaning lives entirely in your head, and the heads of the people around you, completely unwritten, and how little of it you'd ever think to explain to a stranger. Multiply that by every province, every generation, every small community across an empire that lasted for centuries, and you start to understand just how much silence surrounds even the best documented civilizations in history. The Roman Dodecahedron isn't proof that something sinister was covered up. It's proof that ordinary human life has always been far larger and far quieter than the written record ever managed to capture. If you want to know what you think it really was, put your best guess in the comments, and back it up if you can, because the researchers piecing this together are still doing exactly that, one careful excavation, and one honest measurement at a time. If this kind of deep dive into the object's history almost forgot is your thing, subscribe, because there are a lot more drawers like this one still waiting to be opened.